Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Turning Your Genius into a Business and Finding a Market for It. My name is Michelle Eisenberg, and I am a program assistant at the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center. And for those of you who may not know, the NASDAQ Center is a nonprofit that is building a better path for entrepreneurs worldwide by improving inclusion, access, and knowledge in entrepreneurship. So as you're going to see in the chat in a moment, the NASDAQ Center provides programs, resources, and exceptional mentorship to entrepreneurs across all races, industries, and geographies. So definitely make sure to check out those links and resources in the chat. And then just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First, let us know where you are dialing in from in the chat. And second, we're going to open up for live Q&A at the end of the event. So please make sure to submit your questions for us in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation, and we will try our best to get to all of them. Awesome. DC, Texas, Alabama, Chicago, Panama, Florida, Texas, Louisiana, Tennessee, all over the place. Indonesia, thank you all for joining. Alaska, wow. Thank you all. All right. And of course, none of what we do could be possible at the center without all of the amazing support from our sponsors, including NASDAQ, Lehigh University, Bank of the West, Airbnb, KPMG, Wilson Sonsini, Woodruff Sawyer, Microsoft Entrepreneurship for Positive Impact, BPM, and HubSpot for Startups. We are truly humbled by their contributions and hope you are grateful too. And so before we get started, I'm going to just launch a couple polls to step back and see how everyone's doing today. And we use this information to guide the development of future programming. So this first one is going to ask, how are you feeling? Fearful, anxious, surviving, or optimistic? I'll give everyone a few moments to submit a response here. Thank you for participating. All right, I'm going to end this poll and share the results. Looks like optimism is in the lead. That's so awesome to see, but we do have some feelings of surviving and anxiety, so we'll try to address those feelings in our discussion today. Going to stop sharing this poll and launch the second one. What is keeping you up at night? And this one just tells us a little bit more about your current entrepreneurial needs. So I'll give you all a few moments to submit your answers here. Thank you again for participating. All right, I'm going to end this poll and share these results. Looks like finance is in the lead, sales and marketing neck and neck behind, but we do have some needs all across the board. So thank you for participating, and we will take this into account with our future programming. I'm going to stop sharing that one. And without any further delay, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our special guest, Lee Judge. He's a co-founder and CEO at Content Monsta. Lee,
Hello.
welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you today.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's jump right in. We have a really exciting discussion ahead of us. But before we kind of jump into like the strategic content, people come to you for help optimizing marketing's role across various business functions and to, kind of improve their overall sales strategy for their business. So can you talk a little bit about what your business journey has been like, working in sales and marketing, customer experience, and how all of that kind of culminated in your founding of Content Monsta and all the amazing work that you're doing today?
Yeah. Again, thanks for having me. That story is very unexpected and unplanned. So
Yeah.
I've had some kind of business ever since 10th grade. And
Wow.
yeah, my first contract was actually with the high school that I was attending.
Uh-huh.
So I had a DJ company that started when I was in like 11th grade. That was my
Mhm.
first contract. And I kept going with that through college. But for me, it wasn't just a DJ like hobby thing. It was a business. I
Mhm.
had
Yeah.
through college, I had 3 DJ systems. I had
Oh,
contracts
wow.
with hotels and nightclubs all while I was in college.
That's
And from
awesome.
that, yeah, I actually had to develop a database to
Uh-huh.
manage my customers. And it was just for that reason. But the funny thing was, building that database led to me understanding how to create databases.
Mhm.
And that ended up landing me a marketing job. It's kind of started my marketing career, even though I'd been marketing my business, my father's business. But
Mhm.
at that point, we have database creation and we have marketing going at the same time. And
Right.
then I was hired as a marketing director at this customer experience tech company where
Mhm.
they put me in charge of their CRM. So building out their
Okay.
Salesforce instance. And so while I was working there, I was able to bring together my creative background, my
Mhm.
tech background, my marketing background, all kind of together to form Content Monsta. And because I was a marketer, I saw a need for creative agencies that understood corporate marketing and not just creativity. So that's kind of
Right.
the whole story in a nutshell.
Awesome. I love it. So, as you're probably so familiar with in the work that you do, um, people have all sorts of amazing ideas, and oftentimes that can result in a business. But sometimes those business ideas aren't feasible for one way or another. So what are some key indicators that entrepreneurs can just think about when they're kind of evaluating an idea that they have that would indicate that their idea might be a great one?
Well, that's a really good question because just because you have a great idea doesn't mean that there's a market for it or that the
Mhm.
timing is even right.
Sure.
Um, One example for that, I read the other day that the rolling suitcase, for example, was invented in the 50s.
Mhm.
But at that time, no one would buy them because then flying was a high end luxury. And it
Okay.
just so happened that people who had the luxury to fly didn't carry their own luggage. So they had help
Right.
to carry their luggage, right? So if they weren't carrying their own luggage, they didn't care about having a wheel on their suitcase. It wasn't their problem. So
Yeah.
you have a great idea, but there's no market because the market didn't need it. It wasn't until the 70s when flying became affordable for most people who carried their own luggage,
Mhm.
then it became valuable. So I think the main indicator is there a demand for your solution? And another one is, have you witnessed people having pains that your product can solve? Even if they haven't identified the root of that pain, have you seen them having problems around it? And I would say a third one is, does it help someone improve what they're already doing to a measurable extent?
I think that's really interesting because it could give businesses like the opportunity to think about like maybe there's a problem that I can solve that the market doesn't even necessarily recognize. Like, they recognize that they're struggling, but they might not recognize what that problem is, and we have the opportunity to reveal it in a innovative solution. So I like that way of thinking. That's awesome. So if this kind of is a valuable idea to potentially pursue research into, what strategies can businesses or entrepreneurs kind of working as a solopreneur, what strategies can they kind of use to test the viability of an idea before going into the commitment of investing in the development and distribution of a whole product or service, or even creating, an entire new business from scratch?
Yeah, well, I can tell you as an entrepreneur, oftentimes businesses come from a passion, something you really want to get into or you're really close to. But no matter how close you are to it or how much you believe in it, it's important to develop an MVP, a minimal viable product. And
Mhm.
this applies to services as well. You want to create something that demonstrates the solution, but doesn't yet have all the bells and whistles yet. And if your MVP has value, then your market will help tell you what features and benefits to fully develop. So definitely start with some kind of MVP.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's super important, and we can often kind of like skip over that us that the kind of fundamental aspects of what we're trying to solve. in an effort to stand out among all of the competition. So I love that, just kind of going back to the root.
And to add to that, I've recently been involved where there's some software that my company purchases, and we were considering leaving that company for another company.
Mhm.
And when the existing company we worked with was trying to keep us, they were trying to sell us on some new technology that they had or some new offerings. But it turns out that that offering wasn't something we wanted. In fact, I
Right.
don't think anybody wanted that particular thing, but the company was so product led that because the engineers had this cool new feature, they
Mhm.
didn't ask the customers if it even mattered to them. And so, that could happen either deep into a product or service or at the beginning where you're investing in something and don't even know if the customer wants it or not. So that's very
Right.
important to do that early on.
Right, right. And that goes back to kind of what you were saying earlier, also with like the timing of things. Like
Yeah.
that could really, maybe that's something that it just wasn't the right time. But at the same time, like you have to know your customers' needs, you have to know their wants, you have to know what they care about, where they spend their time, those kinds of things. So
Yeah.
super, super important to emphasize. Um, so concept testing is one way that businesses can kind of get their potential buyers directly involved in the process of figuring out the viability of your offering. So, and it may even kind of give you the opportunity to emulate the customer journey for the distinct buyer personas that you may have identified and kind of see how they interact with the offering differently. So, what advice can you give to entrepreneurs when it comes to implementing best practices in the approach for this phase of validation?
I think the best advice I can give you here is not to fall in love with your version of the product. It's possible that the customer
Mhm.
sends you in a totally different direction, and you have to be open to pivot. It may not be the thing you thought it was going to be, but if the market and if your customer says, "Hey, you offered us this, but we use it this way, and we think you should go that way, and we're willing to pay you for it," then you should listen to that. And
Mhm.
so, if they're the ones that are paying you for your product and they give you those signals, you should listen to them.
Right. And I'm just seeing a comment here in the chat that I think is interesting and related to that, in the sense that maybe it's hard to kind of find the place where they are speaking to you.
Mm.
So, I just want to touch on this quickly. Like, how does the market communicate that? Like, without, are there ways that the market kind of naturally communicates their need and their kind of acceptance of what you have to offer, without you having already gone out and found them, if that makes sense?
Yeah, yeah, and then that's kind of back to your MVP, because if you're not too deep into it, you can, add some small pieces, test the market, and part of doing this whole process is
Mhm.
finding out your channels of communication. Because
Right.
if you release a product to market and don't have a means or a plan of how to communicate and engage with your audience, then you don't have a way to know if you're going the right direction or not. So, and somewhere in the process of gaining these customers, you should also be gaining their contact information. So you can
Mhm.
say, in fact, oftentimes when we buy a product and it says, register for the warranty, the only reason they do that is so they can get your information and they can open communications
Yeah.
with you. So if you do something like that to say, hey, here's a free add-on, or here's your support, you get support if you give us your email address, then you
Mhm.
can ask them the next day, week, year, how is the product working for you? Are there any suggestions, any feature changes? If you have customer service, ask them what are the most common questions they hear in terms of frustrations or even things they love and they want more of. So
Mhm.
that communication channel, however you can build that, is really critical to the iterations of the product you're building.
I love that. They're just like, and that was just like, one example of like very simple ways that you can kind of build a digital community around your brand or your business, your product, whatever it may be. And I love kind of the concept of like building this connection and asking them these questions, like, how do you feel about the product? What do you like? What do you not like? What's not working? Because like, it's so important to customers today to kind of feel like they're being heard in a sense, and to feel like they can trust the company that they are, you know, going with to
Yeah.
fulfill their promise to them.
And you can
So,
easily kill your product by doing what you think is right because
right.
you're not the customer, your customer are those who are using it. And there may be something you just don't know about your customer, or that what your product, where your product needs to go. And
Mhm.
so you can easily develop and spend money in the wrong direction if you don't have that open line of communication.
Totally. I love it. That's awesome. And so kind of to focus a little bit in on tech and SaaS companies, because I know we likely have many entrepreneurs in our audience who, are familiar with user testing as kind of their version of concept testing. So can you talk a little bit about some of the key factors that founders leading these types of businesses might want to consider with just the additional complexities and liabilities that might come with having a business online?
Yeah, we kind of touched on that a moment ago, and I'll go a little bit deeper. So,
Yeah.
and this is especially critical with tech companies, is keeping a balance between innovation and customer needs. I mean, you want to
Mhm.
innovate, you want to have your research and development to always have that next thing before your competitor does. But often companies, especially product-led companies, run way too far into creating features that the customer never asked for or doesn't
Mhm.
need. And so managing product changes during testing is important too, because you don't want to change your product so fast where you're proud of the fact that you're agile and you're changing your product, but you have to make sure you give your users time to test it.
Mhm.
So, they need to be able to test it, give you feedback. You need to be able to have time to fine tune your customer communication channels. So I would say, you make a change, you test it, you wait, get feedback, wait some more, then make some more changes.
I love just throughout this conversation so far, like kind of the emphasis on like slowing down, like evaluating, like really like what the impact of what you're doing is going to have on your customer experience, and the connection that they have with what you're offering. Because, I think it can be so easy to be like, I have to get it in front of people right now. There's already people taking up market share. There's already I have to do it now, but like that timing and that waiting and that knowing confidently with all of that evidence and that research is so important to the ultimate success of the offering. So I just love that
I
emphasis
mean,
on slowing down.
yeah, because we're talking about going to market. We're not talking about dominating or being fully in it. We're
Right.
talking about going to market. And so
Yeah,
rush in too quickly, then you could hurt yourself.
totally. I love it. So you know, that kind of jumps right into my next question, honestly, which was kind of related to your go-to-market strategy and, how might different businesses, different kinds of businesses, whether it's a nonprofit, for-profit, whether you're a solopreneur, a larger business with a team, how might you think about your go-to-market strategy differently in a way that minimizes costs for your budget?
So I would suggest asking yourself a few questions when planning
Yeah.
your go-to-market strategy. First of all, make sure that if you're successful, you can immediately serve the size of the market that you're going after. If
Mhm.
not, consider targeting a more manageable size market. Another thing would be, can you balance the go-to-market cost while also keeping reserves to produce, market, and scale your product or service? Because you don't want to scale back quality in order to scale up your production. You don't want to scale back your
Right.
marketing in order to pay for production. So you got to find a balance in there while you're doing it. And this is where you really want to think about, can you go to market with your MVP while using the reserve funds to continue your R&D and your marketing? So that balance has to be kept there.
I love that. And I like that you kind of emphasize like going to market with your MVP, because again, that just emphasizes how like those kind of perks and things can come later once you've validated like the product and how your customers actually feel about it, the way that it solves their problem. So that's just such great advice. And so I want to dive a little bit deeper into the part of like assessing the market that founders need to do, in determining the product market fit for their offering. So what are some ways that entrepreneurs measure whether a market exists for a potential offering? And at the same time, what are some ways that they measure whether it solves that problem that they're having well?
Yeah, I love this part of the process because it reminds me of my father, who was also an entrepreneur, and he would
Yeah.
often use the term, you can't get blood from a turnip, which basically, if you haven't heard the phrase before, it means you can't get something from a place where it doesn't exist. Like
Right.
you can't go to a turnip and squeeze blood because it doesn't exist there. So
Mhm.
I use that term in business a lot to make sure that the market that I target actually has the ability to produce revenue for my service.
Mhm.
For example, if you're selling airplanes, you don't target residents in low income housing.
Mhm.
Likewise, if you're selling window fans, you don't waste your resources marketing to people who own airplanes.
Mhm.
So, those are extreme examples, but it's not uncommon to see people market their business to communities that have no means to even buy their service. So,
Mhm.
in a nutshell, you don't choose a market without considering whether or not that market has the financial ability or desire to even purchase your product.
Right. And like kind of just a quick follow-up to that. Like, do you have maybe an example, or could you just talk about like the approach of like, okay, maybe there is a market, but they don't they're not able to access your offering in one way or another. Maybe it's financial, maybe it's an issue with the way that your product is built or something. What is kind of the thinking that you would go through to understand how your product needs to be like reprioritized, and like what is now most important for the next phase of your product's journey?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple examples from businesses I've owned. In fact, I'll go back to the very first one, which is I mentioned the DJ business.
Yeah.
So I could have thought early on, I probably did early on, that taking my market to students would have been who I wanted to market to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they were the end user, but they weren't the customer. None of them were writing checks to DJs. It
Okay.
was the
Yeah.
school systems. And so I learned early on not to necessarily market to students, but to market to administrators, superintendents, and guidance counselors and people in the school system. So
Mm-hmm.
even then, I could have easily been distracted by who I thought was my audience,
Mm-hmm.
instead of who actually was. I've also seen entrepreneurs for example, they go to events because of a community they have affinity to.
Mm-hmm.
So, let's say, for example, you're into art, for example, and you go to a community, your art festival, and but you want to go there and network to sell real estate.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you go there and you network for selling real estate, I mean, sure, people there have homes and buy real estate, but is that a better market to go to for that networking event than maybe going to a finance event or a real estate event? So
Right.
you have to really think about, is there anybody in the room? I've been to events where people have literally gone into a room of people because they all have a certain affinity for one thing without thinking, really, there's nobody in this room who can actually buy my product.
Mm-hmm.
So they waste their time talking to the masses. And this applies to social media as well. If you're on a social media channel, or if you have followers, let's say, for example, I have thousands of followers as a DJ, but now I'm
Mm-hmm.
selling, business marketing or marketing advice. That isn't the same crowd. I could have
Right.
1 million followers on this platform from that affinity group, but they may not be a single enterprise CEO in that group. So again, you have to really think about who you're marketing to. Is there blood in that turnip? Is there someone in that audience who can actually buy your product?
Yeah, I really love the example that you gave with your DJing experience, because it kind of highlights, I think, some of the journey that B2B2C companies might initially go through as
Yes.
they're thinking of, oh, maybe at the very early stages, some of these founders have thought to themselves, okay, I'm selling to consumers. But maybe it actually makes more sense to sell to a company that is selling to consumers, or whatever that model may be. So there might be that you might think that your audience is one thing, but it's actually something else. And that's so important to highlight. So thank you.
Yeah, it could be a matter of where your
Yeah.
value proposition is, because I mean, the B2B2C example, let's say you make office supplies and you have to sell to office supply stores, but you have a product that office dwellers need to have.
Right.
So you have to consider what's needed in the office, but you're also competing against other companies also selling to these office supply stores. And your value may be something that's not about the product, maybe about how you can deliver or ship, or, it could be something at a business level that differentiates you, not just, how bright your sticky notes are. So.
I love that. And that kind of brings me to another question that I had, which is about value proposition, and kind of, that's your simple way to kind of communicate the value of your offering. So how can founders think about crafting a value proposition in terms of the communication style and their voice for their own offering, that not only informs potential buyers of the offering, but begins to spark that meaningful connection between them?
Well, you said a lot of magical words there: communication, voice, that connection. And for that reason, I mean, it really fits my answer, which is basically leading with your story, especially if your story shows that you have a unique perspective or experience. For example, my agency creates marketing content, and there are thousands of agencies that do that. Our difference is that we've been in the target customer's shoes. Our target customer are VPs of marketing, CMOs, marketing directors, and we know exactly what they're dealing with. I've been a marketing executive who was tasked with hiring agencies. I know what the pains were from hiring agencies or working with agencies, while most of my competitors are creatives. They know how to create videos and audio and content, but they may not understand corporate politics, purchasing processes, and all the things that our buyer, the marketing leaders, have to go through in their jobs as marketers. So, I would suggest doing like that. Find a value proposition based on something that your competitor cannot obtain, no matter what features they offer that are like yours. They're not you. And, all those features can be commoditized, but your experience and your angle and how you approach the solution cannot.
Right. I love that. And that also kind of brings me into the next question that I wanted to ask, but it's really, just it ties into your understanding of your competitor. And, you might have the team and you might have the tools to analyze your competitor, but, value proposition and, kind of taking advantage of what that means and the connection that it can, begin to build between your offering and your customer is that's one way that you can stand out between you and your competitor. And just in the way that you kind of described how your business stands out from competitors, that already makes me want to know more. And that was just such a great example. So how else can entrepreneurs kind of take the information that they are gaining about their competitors and turn that into action that kind of helps them stand out among everyone else?
Okay. Well, first I want to make sure we point out, some people think they have lucked up when they found a market with no competitors. So if there's no
Mm,
competitors, you should question if anyone even wants what you're producing, first of all.
interesting.
Yeah, because there's going to be somebody trying it, hopefully, if there's any value in it, most cases.
Right.
Um, Second, it's important to analyze competitors for the primary reason of knowing what your potential customers are adding to their comparison list. So if you want to make sure you hit all the points that your competitors hitting, you want to know what your customers are reading and studying, because the customer journey now is mostly research done by the customer by themselves. So you want to research what they're
Mm,
researching. I wouldn't suggest obsessing over competitors, however,
yeah.
but you do want to know what features your market needs and know what your customer pains are and do your unique best to serve that market. One major tip I would like to share on top of that is that whatever you see your competitor doing, it does not tell you what they're about to do. It tells you what they're doing now, what they've been doing.
Yeah.
And if you're following or if you're looking at your competitor's website, you may be just following your lead, following your competitor.
Hmm.
I was in a situation a few years back where I worked for an executive who really wanted to duplicate a competitor's website. He loved their website, wanted to do whatever their website did. We had to do it. As soon as we changed our website, their website changed too, which means that they were already in development of the new website
Totally.
while we're
Yeah.
there admiring it, right? So
Right.
we were months behind. So we should have been better off. We would have been better off focusing on what our next move was, as opposed to what the competitor's current move is.
Right. And I think that also kind of touches on an important point, which is, potentially that understanding your competitor is important, but they might not necessarily fully understand your market's needs. They might not
Yeah.
fully understand themselves what their priorities are, how they want to, how they're hoping their solution to be solved or their problem to be solved. So I love that you pointed that out, because I just think that's so important to consider. Um,
And like you
so
said earlier, if you know what your value prop is, remind yourself that they're not you. They don't have what you have. They are not who you are.
mhm.
So once you get past all those things that are commodities like features and those things, there's something about your business you need to know and understand that is unique to you.
Right. And I think this honestly ties really well into marketing, because that's kind of going to be like your main way of communicating this value, to the audience that you've already built and any potential buyers. So, branding is obviously super important. It's a very generalized word that's thrown around a lot. Sometimes we know what it means, sometimes we don't. So can you talk a little bit about what makes good branding so influential in buying decisions? Because we've seen the research, we know that branding has that impact on buyers' decisions. And also, what makes good branding just that? What makes it good? What are the characteristics of good branding?
I like to keep it simple. I think
Yeah.
good branding comes down to psychology,
Mhm.
and the two parts of that are memory and emotion.
Hmm.
So marketing to a prospect takes multiple interactions with the potential buyer. And throughout that journey, first they have to remember that they've seen you before. And
Right.
then secondly, you need to have made them feel some type of emotion, whether it be joy, desire, empathy, hunger,
Mhm.
curiosity, and the most important one's trust. If you can gain those two things, emotion and memory, then you'll find a customer.
That is awesome. And I think that will kind of spark a lot of entrepreneurs to think about like that memory aspect of like how, like getting in front of your potential buyer one time is not going to make you necessarily stick in their memory. You're going to have to be really memorable to have them stick, after one time. So it's going to encourage entrepreneurs to think about like, how can I continue to get in front of those people whose problem I'm trying to solve? And that's just such an important way of thinking that I think is going to be really valuable for entrepreneurs.
Yeah, and to
Yeah.
to extend that, I was thinking as you were saying that, imagine how many really awesome Super Bowl commercials You remember,
Mhm.
but well, actually, the other way around, it made you feel some kind of way. You laughed at it. You thought it was
Right.
funny or touched your heart, but you don't know what brand it was that did it.
Right.
So you don't remember it.
Mhm.
Or you remember a brand. I woke up this morning with a jingle from a commercial in my head, and I don't really know what they sell. I don't care what they sell, but
Mhm.
I remember it.
Yeah.
But if those two things could come together, like I remember what it was and it, sparked the desire or curiosity, then I'm going to look into possibly doing business with them.
Yeah. Um, just a very quick aside. I actually do have a very memorable Super Bowl commercial that I saw many years ago, and it was a Doritos commercial, and it was very dramatic and comedic of a dog crashing through a sliding glass door to get the
Yes.
Doritos. And it was just amazing. It was very memorable, very funny. So I totally stuck in my brain. It was great marketing. So just to continue on the conversation, to the founders that are in our audience, you've likely already thought about where your potential buyer can already be found for the purpose of distributing marketing. So Lee, how does this same type of thinking carry over into the way businesses determine which marketing channels to actually invest their time and money in?
Well, I mean, it's easy to look up the demographics of the media channels and social platforms you use. And if you understand your target audience, then you want to go to the places where they hang out.
Hmm.
And as we said earlier, you want to maybe go away from the places where your target audience doesn't hang out, even if you have an audience in the other
Hmm.
place. So make sure that that audience, when you find them where they are, also have the ability to pay for your service or support your product.
Hmm.
And, again, even if you have a large audience on a platform, that doesn't generally mean that that audience can financially support you. So you may have to bite the bullet and start on a more lucrative platform or marketing channel. For
Hmm.
example, if you, let's say you're an HR recruiter and you have a business of recruiters and you've got a tremendous following on Instagram,
Hmm.
you might want to be on LinkedIn instead. So, you may be not wasting time, but you may find a lot more traction on a platform like LinkedIn than you would on Instagram. Not to say you couldn't do both, but you have to really figure out, even if you have an audience somewhere, is that the audience where you can put your most energy into? Is that the audience that can afford your product? Is that the
Hmm.
audience that your message will resonate with?
Right. And I that honestly is so important because it makes you kind of consider, like, I think it can be really easy to fall into the belief of like everyone's on social media, everyone is there, and kind of not really recognizing that there are different audiences on these different platforms. And you may not see the same type of engagement on one platform that you're going to see on another. So so important to do your research and be intentional with those channels. I love it.
And
Um,
don't forget the ones that are
yeah,
non-traditional. I mean, like, for example,
yeah.
I use Nextdoor. I'm a homeowner. I'm in a neighborhood. If I want to find a plumber or someone to fix the yard, I may go to
Mhm,
Nextdoor. You wouldn't think about that in your top social. If I say, hey, go to social, you're thinking Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, LinkedIn,
mhm.
but you're not thinking Nextdoor or Reddit or
Right.
whatever. So you got to consider what you do. If my service is plumbing or electrical, I may want to focus solely on Nextdoor and not worry
Mhm.
about Facebook. So that's another consideration.
Right. Yeah. No, that's super important. And so I want to jump ahead a little bit because we are running low on time. But kind of just looking at the, like, okay, let's say you've built this go-to-market strategy, you've done your research, it's strong, and you hopefully have kind of an overarching vision or strategy that you're building for the product journey, and the customer journey for that product or service. So, what are some of the key components of that overarching strategy that founders should focus on as they're utilizing their go-to-market strategy to bring that vision to life?
Okay. Well, there's a lot to consider.
Yeah,
So I'll just mention a few that come top of mind.
totally.
And kind of a summary of what we talked about as well. Product development, make sure you have a strong offering that solves someone's pain or a
Hmm.
strong desire. Make sure you know your target audience. Remember, you can't get blood from a turnip.
Hmm.
Um, Add in some type of digital strategy in there. You have to make sure you are creating content. Given I'm a bit biased on that because that's what my company does. We create content marketing,
Yeah.
but that's really how customers communicate and how you can connect with them and build that community we spoke about earlier and
Hmm.
become that trusted advisor. You have to create content to educate your audience. Again, choose the right target audience. Pricing strategy, you want to adjust according to what the market will bear, or at least the perceived value of your offering, which
Hmm.
they can often compete, those two things. But if you look at, like,
Right.
say, for example, Apple, the perceived value is very high. It isn't
Hmm.
about what the market can bear. It's about what Apple says it's worth. If Apple
Right.
comes out with
Yeah.
an iPhone and says this perceived value is $1,000 for this phone, people will pay for it,
Right.
despite the fact that competitor may be $500. So
Hmm.
pricing strategy is big. Your promotion plan, what tactics will you add to your strategy to gain
Hmm.
attention? Attention is a huge part of the game. And then also customer support. Once you launch this product or service, you have to open up communication channels with your customers, because bad or no support can kill an otherwise good product. So have a plan for how you will execute on support and open communication with your customers.
Love it. Super important. And I think a lot of what you just said is kind of going to apply to your answer potentially to the next question, last question before we jump into live Q&A. But, scaling up your offering and kind of, envisioning that greater expansion and like long-term vision of that offering, how can founders approach that phase of the business while keeping the why, like their purpose of the business and the people that, like, we've emphasized how important the people are to like keep at the center and the forefront of what you're doing. So how would you kind of think about approaching scaling up like your offering,
Yeah.
or yeah, to keep kind of purpose and people at the center?
Yeah, that's something that as an entrepreneur, that never stops. I mean, every day you're looking at how to keep the business going and growing. So you'll always be thinking about whether or not to scale up or scale
Mhm.
out. Of course,
Right.
scaling up, vertical scaling is increasing the output of what you're already doing, and scaling out, horizontal scaling, is doing new things. So
Hmm.
you're always trying to figure out, are we scaling up or are we scaling out? And scaling out to new things can have you questioning your purpose. It can get you off
Yeah.
track really easy. But it also gives opportunity to keep the company interesting and growing and developing new products, and can be even attractive to employees.
Hmm.
Scaling up can help you keep focused because you're doing the same thing at a bigger scale. So it can keep you focused on your purpose, but it also requires more attention to what this means from a human and a technical resource viewpoint.
Hmm.
So scaling up, scaling out will always be a part of the entrepreneurial journey. And you have to keep, like you said, keep people in mind, as well as what is your purpose, because those are two things that can easily get out of hand if you scale up or scale out too quickly.
Love it. Yep. Just keeping it simple. It's awesome. All right. We have some awesome Q&A coming in. So let's just jump right in, see if we can get to as many as
Okay.
possible. So we have a lot of, it looks like we have a lot of
Yeah.
entrepreneurs here who are leading service-based businesses. So how, if at all, does like some of the advice you've kind of given around like communication of your value and like approach to channels and your presence and building that customer base, how might that look different with more of a service-based company versus a product-based?
Well, most of my businesses, the businesses that I've owned have been service based. The business I've
Mhm.
worked for have been product, primarily tech. So I've got a
Okay.
pretty good picture of both sides. And I will tell you that from a product base, it's more about customer service because you're selling more pieces, right? And each
Mhm.
piece is a customer who wants to communicate with you about how good or bad that product is.
Okay, yeah.
Whereas a service, it's a lot more personable. Someone is more than likely seeing that customer face to face. And so you got to consider the customer service is a little bit different in that aspect. So I would say that in a service oriented company, you put a lot more focus on the personal part of it, as
Mhm.
opposed to, with a product, if the product doesn't work well, you say, we'll send you a new one.
Mhm.
But from a service standpoint, if the service wasn't good, you can't just send them a new one. And it
Mhm.
costs you a lot to just do it again. You will more likely lose the customer if your service isn't good all the time. So
Mhm.
that's the biggest difference. Service has to maintain a high level of quality, whereas you might get some leeway on a product and you can say, well, that was version 2.0, wait till version 2.1 comes. And you keep the customer going, you
Yeah.
know what? I was about to leave, but I like the features that are coming down your pipeline. Whereas
Right.
with service, you can't say, hey, that was service 1.0. Wait till we come back next time. They're like, don't come back next time. So
Right.
that's the
Totally.
biggest difference, I think.
Totally. No, I love that distinction. I think that's just like such a really great way to look at it. And I want to just dive a little bit deeper into like the MVP specifically and kind of like, you know, okay, if you're a service company, and you're kind of trying to think about like what is the minimum service that needs to be provided to be, acceptable quality in the perspective of the customer. How do you kind of think about like where the line is? Like, where do you draw that line?
I would suggest you start with the base of the service that has the most use, the most customers. For example, if you, I'll use my company as an example. We create content, right? And
Mhm.
so our customer's biggest pain is creating the content, like creating audio, creating video.
Mhm.
We could dive right in and say, we'll also do your social media scheduling as well.
Mhm.
But day one, we focused on creating great content.
Yeah.
And then we, scale horizontally by adding in social media management. It
Mhm.
wouldn't have made sense to start off with social media management because we know that the reason why we exist because social media managers need content. So we
Right.
started with the base, the most basic need. And so, like if you're doing hair, you may decide, well, let's do some exotic hairstyles, but you realize a wash and a perm is what almost everybody needs. Start there
Mhm.
and then bring on the exotic hairstyles as you grow. So, you know, I would suggest that, especially with service industry, if you're doing pools, do square ones first and worry about the oblong shaped ones later, the odd shapes later. Start with what most people need, and then you can afford to scale and try different things.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. I love it. So there's a really interesting question here, and maybe this person can give us a little bit more context potentially, but I think what they're trying to ask is basically about like how do you kind of approach um your your the way that you react or act in against your competitors if a competitor is like a government entity? Like, does that kind of change the way you might be able to understand or kind of your accessibility to that market that they hold?
That's interesting. I'm trying to think of a scenario when that would be,
Hmm.
because typically the government's not trying to do anything. They're trying to find contractors to do things. So it'd be another contractor contracting to the government. I have seen cases where in government proposals or RFPs, where they're asking for companies to provide services, and those services, you're competing against someone, and sometimes the RFP doesn't even make sense or doesn't, one company can't do that, maybe multiples can't do it. So you have to figure out what are they really asking. So I'm not
Hmm.
so sure I'm clear on their
Sure.
question. Um,
Yeah.
Especially
Okay. Yeah.
because the
Maybe.
government doesn't do things most of the time. They hire contractors and entrepreneurs to do the things for them.
Sure. Yeah, maybe that person can clarify a little bit more in
I mean,
the
the government
Q&A.
doesn't even build weapons for that matter. The government buys weapons.
That is true. Yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah. Let's keep going. In our we have a whole bunch of others coming in. We have a question here about pricing that I think is interesting, kind of, and I want to ask a little bit more broadly, just how do you kind of work your pricing strategy into your marketing and your value proposition and those kinds of things in a way where like you can stand confidently behind the price that you have set for what you're offering?
It requires putting quite a bit of time in market research. You know, on a high level, look around, see what your competitors are charging. That
Mhm.
also requires you understanding what they really provide, because they can always gloss over what they provide. And you may find out, and this is a great thing for you to tell your prospective customers, to say, look, they only charge $1,000 because they really don't do A, B, and C. We
Mhm.
charge $5,000 because we do. So you may have to interpret for your customers what prices they're seeing in the market and why yours has a higher value. I would never price to be the lowest, because then it's
Mhm.
a race to the bottom. There's always be somebody cheaper, no matter what your industry you're in. Somebody can always do it cheaper. They may not be
Mhm.
able to do it better. They may not have your story or experience. So I always advise to price for the value you bring, for the quality you bring, and not for racing to the bottom with the market.
Right.
So yeah, examine the market, find out what the market will bear. You know, that may sound greedy, but the reality is you could lose business by not charging the market standard. You know,
Mhm.
you may be able to do it cheaper, but how that can be perceived, and which is true in most cases, if you're too much cheaper than your competitors, you're probably missing something. You're
Mhm.
probably not providing the standard of service you need to provide. Say, for example, you have a whole lot cheaper equipment than your competitor who charges more. On
Mhm.
your website, on your brochure, you do the exact same thing. You claim to provide the exact same service, but they're $10,000 more than you are. Reality is you bought all cheap equipment that allows you to do it cheaper.
Right.
The reality also is if you both go to do the same job, your equipment breaks down because you've got cheap equipment
Yep.
and you're out of business now. They're charging more because they have more high level equipment. So,
Yeah.
and the same thing goes for competitive analysis. If your competitor is way cheaper, there could be a reason for that you don't want to try to compete with.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about. And that kind of just goes back to that concept of like, don't automatically assume that your competitor knows best. Uh,
Right.
Love it. So this is another question that I think is really interesting. I think in trying to understand your potential buyers, demographic information can be like a super easy statistic to kind of like fall on to try to learn about your customers. So how like how much do those pieces of information actually tell us about our customers' behavior and their needs and their priorities? And if so, maybe it does in certain industries, certain situations. How do people kind of go about ethically collecting that information?
Well, that's getting harder and harder with privacy settings, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's two levels to it. I mean, demographics is what we've traditionally done,
Hmm.
and that information is easier to obtain. But the best way to separate your personas is psychographically, not
Mm.
demographically. So, demographically, I may be a, a male in Georgia, but
Hmm.
psychographically, what do I really love to do? What makes me crave a certain food, or why do I want certain things? Psychographically is way more valuable to you. If you are selling blenders, you are you can benefit much more from knowing that I'm into health food than
Right.
that I'm a male in Georgia with a house. That doesn't help you at all.
Right.
And if you're targeting on social, you can only get but so far. You
Hmm.
won't know Facebook knows everything. Google might, but
Sure.
you
Yeah.
have to dig deeper. You can probably figure out that if I like healthy things or not. But begin to think on that level. You may be able to get some data that says, this person's a health buff, but
Sure.
think on and study psychographics
Mhm.
more than demographics, and that'll help you find your customer better. Now, in terms of getting that data, I'm not going to say it's easy. It's not easy. But it starts with understanding your customer. And then
Mhm.
once you understand your customer, make some psychographic personas, and
Mhm.
then that I think will guide you into where to go look for those people to be.
I love that. I love that. I think that's so important. Some entrepreneurs may not have even heard of like the word psychographic. So now they have something to go learn about, which I love. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Reviews are a big way that people kind of get feedback on their products, on their services. How much should we rely on that information gathering in the actual decisions that we make long term for the product or service?
I think that varies a lot depending on your product or service.
Okay.
It also depends on where you're getting those from. If
Right.
you're depending on, 4 or 5 stars on Yelp or comments on Yelp or somewhere that's public like that, I would take it kind of lightly because it
Yeah.
could be fake, it could be bad, it could be purchased. It's kind
Mhm.
of hard to say.
Yeah.
I think I would lean more heavily on, as we mentioned earlier, that customer communication directly, where you can
Yep.
ask them. So if you have any way to say, even reward a customer for giving you their information, because, you know, if they're already a customer or if they have your product, whether it be free or purchased,
Mhm.
then you've already gained their trust to an extent. So get their information, communicate with them, make them feel like an insider to help your product develop, and they'll be happy to participate, to say, wow, thanks for asking me about how I like my blender. I wish that it had 3 more speeds on it or something, or the blades were
Right.
sharper. But you can't ask me that if you didn't maintain the relationship. If you just
Totally.
sold it to me and walked away, you lose more than the customer does because you don't get a chance to build that
Right.
community.
Yeah, I love it. Awesome. Okay, we are out of time, but if you had just one key takeaway that you wanted to leave with the audience, a piece of professional wisdom, personal wisdom, anything, what would that be?
Wow. Uh, be flexible, be ready to change your product no matter how passionate you are about it, because the market and the customer determines the success of your product, not your passion for it.
I love it. Thank you so, so much, Lee, for taking the time to speak to our community
Thank
and
you.
share all of these amazing insights.
My pleasure.
On behalf of NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center and everyone in attendance today, we sincerely thank you for joining us. And to our audience, we would love for you to join us again for upcoming webinars, which you'll be able to view using the link in the chat. And thank you all again for joining us today. We look forward to welcoming you back online with us soon. Bye.